During a recent House committee hearing, Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib decided to grill the CEOs of the major banks in the United States on the topic of pollution and how their investments in fossil fuel companies leads to pollution, specifically in poor neighborhoods, in poor parts of the country, and in parts of the country that, by the nature of them being poor, tend to be communities of color. Now, what was amazing about this was just how easily she calls them out on their ignorance on the topic of environmental racism. Watch.
I just want to ask one by one, yes or no. Are you familiar with the term environmental racism? I'll start with Chase.
Vaguely,
are you familiar with environmental racism?
I said vaguely, yes.
Vaguely, okay. How about you, Citigroup? Ms. Frazier?
The same, only vaguely. I don't know the specific definition of it.
That's fine. And how about you, Mr. Gorman?
No, I'm not.
Morgan Stanley isn't familiar. Okay, how about Bank of America? Are you all familiar with the term environmental racism?
Vaguely familiar, but same.
Yep, Wells Fargo. Do you know what environmental racism is? Yes or no?
Congresswoman.
That's unfortunate. How about you, Mr. Solomon, Goldman Sachs?
Vaguely familiar, but not specifically.
I love that. I mean, just to give you an idea of what she's talking about and why she's grilling bank CEOs about it. The 6 CEOs at the hearing lead financial institutions that together have invested 1.1 trillion with a T, trillion in fossil fuels since the 2015 Paris Climate Agreement. And that's according to a recent report from several environmental groups entitled Banking on Climate Chaos. Environmental racism is certainly something that we need to talk about more moving forward, because the polluting activities of these major companies and corporations, of course, disproportionately impact poor communities, communities of color, essentially communities that have no power and aren't able to aggressively fight back against the behavior that's taking place.
Yeah, obviously, as with anything disastrous and catastrophic that tends to happen in America, poor working people, Black people, indigenous people, Latin people tend to suffer at a disproportionate amount. However, I kind of wish that they wouldn't position this as environmental racism, because let's be honest, Jamie Dimon doesn't give a damn if Black people are harmed by an investment that his firm has made. In fact, to him, that's like, well, that means I'm doing it right. If I'm only harming Black people, I'll have nobody to be against this thing. I wish they would position it a little bit differently, because I'm sure viewers of TYT will remember the Keystone Pipeline and getting that blocked and stopped. And the coalition of people who got involved, as far as the boots on the ground, was a diverse array of Americans and Canadians, quite frankly, as has ever been seen. It's like it's indigenous people all the way up in North Dakota to farmers in Nebraska and everything in between. They banded together to stop this thing, and that was environmental pollution. People were like, man, we don't want our drinking water to permanently be compromised by this thing that nobody actually needs. It's just there for corporate greed. So I do wish they would position it a little bit differently, because let's face it, the sad reality is, if you're the CEO of a firm like JP Morgan Chase or Goldman Sachs, and you add one Black or brown or woman's face up on your corporate board, everybody's gonna pat you on the butt and say what a good job you're doing to help the lives and the plight of Black, brown, and indigenous people in this country. When in reality is, you're funding stuff that are doing the opposite, actually ruining the lives of these people.
So I want to go to the next video because, well, actually, before I do, I agree with what you're saying, and you're hitting at something that I also wanted to articulate about how, yeah, they don't really know much about environmental racism or what's happening in communities that are tend to be much poorer because they're good. Like we live in a country that's actually really two different countries, and they're living large. They're not worried about pollution or an oil refinery or some sort of catastrophic environmental issue where they're living at, because they're protected and they have the resources to weather any storm, right? In their minds. I mean, obviously things can get so bad that their money can't protect them, and we're quickly approaching that phase. But when it comes to our lawmakers who can invest in individual stocks and their investments typically beat out the stock market, which gives you an idea of just how corrupt they are. When it comes to CEOs of major banks, they're not in any way concerned about the things that keep Americans up at night. So have they heard about environmental racism? Of course not. They're not concerned about it. It does not apply to them. Let's go to the next video where Tlaib gets a little more specific about the issue.
Well, I want you all to know environmental racism showed its face in a deadly way during the pandemic in my district, where more of my Black neighbors died at a higher rate from COVID than any other community in Michigan, even though our Black population in Michigan is less than 15%. The pre-existing health conditions that come from living in the backyard of corporate polluters financed by your banks. When it comes to racial justice, I see many of you having these commitments to just diversify your executive ranks. Good. But I think the American people really truly want to know, what about the actions that are needed to invest in our communities like mine that you all profited off of, that left us with more pollution, decay, and poverty? You all should know and be familiar with the term environmental racism, because for generations, Black, brown, and indigenous communities have seen the fossil fuel corporations use your banks to finance and construct oil and gas refineries, petrochemical plants, and pipeline projects. These polluting projects haven't been built in wealthy neighborhoods.
I have to say, oftentimes I'm a little critical of progressive Democrats because they love to flex muscle on Twitter or even during these hearings. And I want to see more action, right? So how about withholding your vote as a block on must-pass bills to ensure that we get our priorities included as provisions in the legislation, all of that. But at least at the very heart of what we're seeing right now with this wonderful exchange between Tlaib and these corporate CEOs, is that we're at least being represented, to some extent. And it's so rare these days to see it in Congress that whenever you do see an exchange like that, it makes news for good reason, because finally we're hearing what actual working Americans have been suffering from for a long time and have not been represented by the likes of, Nancy Pelosi, or certainly not, someone like Mitch McConnell, a Republican whose #1 priority is to just continue cutting taxes for the rich. But just to give you a little more context into what Congresswoman Tlaib was talking about there, she gave as example the Marathon Refinery, a 250-acre oil processing facility and tank farm near the Boynton neighborhood of Detroit, which has received 15 violation notices from the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy for pollution since 2013. The area, which includes more than 24 industrial sites, is 71% Black. Also, Detroit is the 10th worst metro area in the country when it comes to asthma attacks for Black children, which a 2017 report from the NAACP and other groups said is linked to oil and gas exposure. So these are communities that haven't been represented. These are communities who have been neglected, forgotten, and Rashida Tlaib wants to raise awareness about what her constituents have been suffering. But when she's raising awareness about that, she's really speaking for or on behalf of so many Americans across this country that have been neglected by our congressional lawmakers.
Yeah, and what I did like too, because again, I was not a fan of the way that they racialized COVID-19, because again, like, people are taught not to give a damn about the things that affect only Black people, only Mexican people, only whatever, marginalized group. I like that she connected it to, no, these people died at a disproportionate rate because of pollution that you guys put in their neighborhood. This isn't some genetic or racial phenomenon. It's like, no, they happen to live in the places that got polluted by the corporate interests. I love that she connected those two things and made it plain for everybody to understand. And I just wish they would do that more often and take it to the next step further and be like, look, guys, they did that in this neighborhood just now. You know where you live. You know that there are people who live in much better, richer neighborhoods than yours, and you better know they'll never go there. So they coming to your town next. I would hope that they would use the fear mongering against the corporate interests every now and again.
Well, you might actually enjoy this next clip. It's our final clip of this story, and she has one final question for these CEOs. Let's watch.
48217, the neighborhood I represent with Marathon there, is the most polluted zip code in the state of Michigan, a majority Black community. So I want to ask you all one by one. Chase Bank, Mr. Diamond, do you live near a refinery? Yes or no? Do you live near an oil refinery?
I do not.
How about you, Ms. Frazier? Do you live near an oil refinery?
No, I do not.
Mr. Gorman, do you live near an oil refinery?
No.
Mr. Is it Myha? Am I saying it right? From Bank of America, Brian, do you live near a refinery?
I do not.
How about you, Mr. Sharp? How about you? Do you have Marathon Oil Refinery in your backyard?
No, I don't.
How about you, Mr. Solomon?
No, I don't.
So I need you all of you to address racial equity. What that means is understanding environmental racism and reversing decades of it and halting the damage that you all continue to invest in.
My favorite part about that was, first of all, the question was a great question because I think that she's hitting at what you were referring to, Woz. But the Bank of America CEO, where she's like, hey, you, I don't know how to pronounce your name. Like, you know that got under his skin. We know what these corporate executives are like. Like, Brian, hey, do you live near an oil refinery? He looked super annoyed. I loved it. So yeah, that was great.
That's a trick we used to use on the basketball court. And whenever there was a white boy on the court, we'd be like, "Hey, white boy!" We knew his name was Tyler, but we called him white boy anyway. That was a trick we used to use back on the court, back in the days, back when I used to hoop.
Thanks for watching The Young Turks. Really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR. So those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.